Thank you very much. I suppose everybody can hear me. Good. It's great for me to be here, and thank you very much, Foreign Policy Association and BNP Paribas for inviting me here. I want to acknowledge several people here. First, of course, our Consul General, Gafur. Can you stand up, please? Thank you. I was walking around New York City today, and people thought he was my son. Yes, I am. The famous Imam Faisal. Can you get up? A good friend of mine, great friend. He wrote the book. Yeah. He wrote the book. What is right with Islam is what is right with America. Is that it? Yeah. And then he just wrote another book, which is to be published in May. My good friend Wayne Forrest, of course, the head of American Indonesia Chamber of Commerce. Donald Weatherby, who is a good friend of my dad and a prominent Indonesianist. Yeah. Thank you. Zubaid from Citi, who predicted that Indonesia would be the top 6 economy or something in 30 years' time, which I did not object to, of course. Yeah. Good. I have one more friend, a famous actor, Nicholas Saputra, who's here to promote his new film, something about the zoo. What is it? Postcards from the Zoo at the Tribeca Film Festival. Of course, the reason why I usually travel with my wife, but the reason why I'm not traveling with her because he's here today. So, and John Riyadi, which is one of the most famous young Indonesian columnists, and also very good. And Alan Harari. Also another great Indonesia friend. One more person, Naomi Bishops, who does what is called Joyo News, this email service about all the things that you need to know about Indonesia, right? And that's Phil Scanlon, the Australian Consul General, who is also very kind to be here tonight and a very good friend. So thank you very much, everybody, for coming here. I want to talk here about Indonesia's transformation. Let me begin by telling you that this is the 3rd time that I live in the United States. The first time was about 1979, and I remember the moment I arrived. I arrived and I went to the embassy, and there was a politician who gave a speech at the embassy, and in that speech he made a public oath that he is not running for president of Indonesia and that he would never run for president of Indonesia and he would never betray President Suharto at the time, and so on and so on. And it baffled me. Why would somebody need to make that kind of, oath, And fast forward, compared to where Indonesia is today, where I could not find anyone who does not want to run for president. It's an incredible political transformation. And the fact that I'm here as ambassador is also a revelation, because someone like me about 30 years ago would never become ambassador to the United States. This is a post usually reserved for generals for so long. Right? This is what I want to talk to you about, Indonesia's transformation. And I think Indonesia's transformation is one of the most successful transformational stories around the world, especially as we step into the 21st century. And it's more so important if you compare it to where we were in the year 2000. This is when we just began our democracy. I was posted here as political counselor in the year 2000 until 2002. And back then, Indonesia was really a basket case. We couldn't do anything right. And I couldn't get any attention in Washington, D.C. Indonesia had a very bad reputation as a result of the East Timor fiasco. People were worried that Indonesia would break apart like the Balkans. That's why the term Balkanization became very popular in Indonesia. The economy was contracting by minus 13%. We had growing ethnic conflicts. We had growing separatist rebellions. We had political instability, social disruptions, riots. It seemed as if our democracy was going to crumble. So it was a very bad time to be Indonesian. And to be honest, I was a bit of a pessimist. I'm usually an optimist, as a diplomat, you always have to be an optimist. But those were the times when even I had doubts about where Indonesia was and where Indonesia was heading as a democracy, as a young democracy. And today, that's all behind us. Indonesia now is in a very, very different place. Now Indonesia is the world's third largest democracy. And Indonesia is the largest economy in Southeast Asia. We're the 18th largest economy in the world. We have the largest middle class in Southeast Asia. We have an economy that's growing at 6.5%, which is the third highest in Asia after China and India. We have political stability. Now we call ourselves an emerging economy. In the past, we used to call ourselves a third world country, and to be honest, I didn't like that term. Third world country is as if when you run a train, there's a first class passengers, second class passengers, and third, and we're on third. So I never really liked that term, but even we call ourselves third world countries. But now we don't call that anymore. We call ourselves emerging economy, and we do so proudly so, right? So there's a great political, economic, and mental transformation that's happening in Indonesia, and this is what I want to tell. I want to tell you about. What has that transformation revealed? Right? It revealed many things. First, it revealed that democracy and development are two things that we don't have to choose. Now, this is important because when I grew up and when I studied in university, there used to be a thought that you can't have both. You either have democracy but less development, or you have development, a lot of high growth, but less democracy. And certainly Indonesia was on the second part. We had a lot of high growth, but we had authoritarian government. And for us, that was justified with the notion that you can't have both, right? And for a while we bought that, and especially there was a debate about the Asian values, which was quite popular in Asia, that provided some kind of philosophical justification for that. But our experience proved not true. You can have democracy. We are now the strongest democracy in Southeast Asia, and we're the third largest democracy in the world. And we are a vibrant, dynamic, and stable democracy, while at the same time our economy is growing. As I said, 6.5%, and the third highest in Asia. So we reveal and we prove that we don't have to choose between democracy and development, and you can't have both. And I think Arab Spring countries or other countries that are having democratic transition can look at Indonesia and become more convinced of their transition. Secondly, it revealed that we don't have to choose between democracy and national unity. Now, I say this because the whole debate about why democracy was not right for Indonesia or was not ripe for Indonesia was because, well, Indonesia is so complex, hundreds of ethnic groups. Once you have democracy, the country will break apart, right? So that was the argument, and it seemed pretty good argument at the time. But once we became a democracy, yes, Timor-Leste separated from Indonesia in 1999. But afterwards, Indonesia became even stronger, became more united. In fact, I can tell you that what happened was the reverse of Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, two countries that broke apart after political liberalization. Indonesia, I think national coherence in Indonesia has never been stronger. The conflict in Aceh, which was running for about 30 years, has been resolved in just 5 months of negotiations, which took 5 rounds. Never in, well, I wouldn't say never, but rarely in history of conflict resolution has a conflict that has endured for so long, 30 years, resolved in 5 rounds of negotiations. And we are promoting political reforms in Papua as well. But the point is, slowly we are changing our approach, and because of that, our democracy is leading to a stronger national unity in Indonesia. And another revelation is that our democracy has also led to stability. Right? Now, this is something quite expensive, and if you look at democratic transitions, it can only go 3 ways. One is that it goes stronger, or it goes flat, it stagnates, or it decays and sometimes even crumbles, right? Majority of democratic transitions in recent decades is either flat or it goes down, right? But Indonesia, alhamdulillah, has been able to grow stronger. And in fact, we have been able to marry democracy with political stability. And that is a rare thing. We don't take it for granted, but we reached that stability since 2003. So there was a transition of about 4 years. In that 4 years between 1998 until 2001, 2002, we had one president a year on average, right? And then after that, we had a very stable governments from 2004 to 2009, and then now from 2009 until 2014. The other revelation is that our democracy actually got along well with decentralization. Indonesia has been trying to decentralize for a long time. This is a word that has gained currency for many decades. But no one really did it, right? Now, only in the last 6 years or so, we committed the most ambitious decentralization program, where every governor, every regent, every state legislators, every mayor is directly elected by the people. So the political pyramid that was like this turned upside down like this, right? Now, all this is happening without a single bloodshed, without war, conflict, or chaos. People even call it the quiet revolution. And we prove that you can strengthen democracy while at the same time advancing decentralization. And the last thing that it revealed is that in Indonesia, democracy, Islam, and modernity can go hand in hand. This was always the big questions. Even those who promoted democracy in Indonesia, my American friends, they had this thing at the end, at the back of their head. What would happen? Would this unleash political Islam in ways that would turn Indonesia into an Islamic state? They were thinking that. They were not saying it out loud, and many of us in Indonesia were also thinking about that. And to be truthful, dozens of Islamic parties turned up, proliferated, right? But Indonesia never became an Islamic state. In fact, the Islamic parties turned out to be the most strongest proponents of Indonesia's democracy. Now, you figure that, right? And I think the reason is it's only by supporting democracy that their existence as Islamic party can be guaranteed, right? So in that sense, they say, hey, we've never had a political system where Islamic parties are allowed to this extent. So we like democracy, right? So democracy and Islam develop a symbiosis, and also it develops symbiosis with modernity. Now, why do I say this is important? I think one of the most eye-opening things that I ever experienced when I worked for President Yudhoyono was my trip to Middle East, right? When I went to the Middle East, I think this was about 6 years ago, it was very hard to get what was called the 3-in-1. Almost every country in the Middle East was Islamic. So everybody, every country was Islamic. Second, what if countries that were Islamic and also modern, right? Then you cut the number into half or something, right? Not too many. And then you ask, what if for countries that had all three, all 3-in-1, Islamic, modern, and also democratic? It went from here to almost here, right? So this is why the Arab Spring is important in that sense. But in Indonesia, after our democratic transitions, Islam, democracy, and modernity went hand in hand effortlessly. You ask me why? I don't know. I can't explain it. Maybe Imam can explain it later. But there's no bloodshed. There was no soul-searching debate. It just happened easily and effortlessly, right? And that is, I think, what is beautiful about the Indonesian experiment. And that is why people say if the Indonesian experiment failed, just like if the American experiment failed, the world would fail, right? And that is the largest significance of Indonesia's transformation. Now, what explains the success of our transformation? I think one is pragmatism, right? We had leaders who were very idealistic, high-sounding rhetorics and so on. But if you look at every turn of where Indonesia made the right political and historical decisions, is because we made pragmatic decisions. So pragmatism was the key in Indonesia's transformations. It was so in 1997, it was so in 1999, 2004, 2009, and so on and so on. The second reason is because when we got reforms and democracy, we took it and ran as fast as possible with it. Now, this is what I would tell my friends in Myanmar. This is what I would tell my friends in Egypt. You know, once you get it, don't just walk around with it. You know, grab it and run as fast as possible. And your strategic goal is that in as short as time as possible, you create a political situation whereby democracy would become irreversible. It would achieve a point of no return. In Indonesia now, it's unthinkable. You can, don't take my word for it, you ask any Indonesian, is a military coup possible? No Indonesians would say yes, right? Knock on wood, right? But keep in mind, this is this is a luxury, because in Thailand, after so many years of being a democracy, they still had military coup, right? So in Indonesia, I believe I can say with confidence that we have achieved a point of no return. There can be no military coup in Indonesia, and that democracy is here in Indonesia permanently to stay. The third factor that explains our success is that we made sure that change was not bottom up, but also top down. In fact, it is this synergy between top down change and bottom up change that produce where we are today. Now, I say this because, look, let's be honest, the revolution or the transition in 1997 and 1998, all the turbulence, this was all bottom up. You know, it was all popular uprising against the government, right? But some reason we were able to combine it, especially in the later part of the year 2000, 2001, 2002, 2003, with good change at the bottom, at the top, from the top, right? Leaders start making populist decisions that made sense, and they all synergize to deliver a good transformation that we have today. Fourth, we made mistakes. We made many mistakes, but we made sure that those mistakes made our democracy even more mature. We learned from those mistakes. Now, I say this because, you know, you see the transitions in Myanmar and other places. And what I tell my friends is, look, you know, and in Egypt and other places, look, let them make some mistakes. Because democracies that doesn't learn from mistakes and doesn't make mistakes is going to be an immature democracy. Just like a person, if you grow up never feeling hurt or pain or never having made a mistake, you never become a truly grown-up person, you know. So the fact that we made some mistake and we learned from those mistakes made us more mature in our democratic transitions. And fifth, we found a healthy complementarity between our nationalism and our internationalism. This is always important for us because in Indonesia's history, you tend to get leaders or a sector of population who are becoming very nationalistic, but at the same time xenophobic. You know, in some democratic transitions, you still see that. Right? Now, in Indonesia, alhamdulillah, we evolved the right kind of nationalism, but also the right kind of internationalism. We think that these two are complementary. Indonesian people began to see the world not as a threat, but as an opportunity, right? As something that makes them stronger and better and more prosperous, right? So they were not afraid of the world. They saw the world as something that is part of their national asset, right? This is an important mindset that I think corresponds with a recent polling taken by a French NGO. This French NGO took a polling of the youth around the world, right? And from this polling, the youth around the world were asked questions: what do you think about globalization? You know, are you afraid of it or are you not? And so on and so on. This is very interesting because in that polling, you know, the youth from which country registered the highest favor for globalization? Chinese. 91% of young Chinese love globalization. Not just like it, not just tolerate or don't mind it, but they love it. You know, they really see it as part of China's future. The Indians, I think, were about 89%. Greece was very low at about 41%, right? And America, can you guess? about 76%, right? So in Indonesia, this is what you see also. You see uh, people, politicians seeing the world as an opportunity. And I think that is one factor that made us, our transition successful. If we were becoming xenophobic, we would become a much weaker democracy. And this is why I think we have been able to convert what previously was a soft spot or a weakness into strength. And what do I mean by this? People used to say Indonesia had resources curse. We had a lot of resources. We have oil, gas, rubber, cocoa, you name it. And yes, there was a time that we didn't handle this very well, but now the resources that used to be possible resources scarce now is becoming an asset. The population, 99% of Indonesia's population at the time of independence used to be illiterate. Right? There were heavy burden on the state, and there was a big challenge on how to produce a prosperous state with that kind of social conditions. But now our population is the reason why Indonesia is included in many projections of future and bright emerging economies by Zubaid, who says that Indonesia's middle class will continue to grow. Indonesia is about 240 million people, right? Soon there will half of them will be urbanized, and soon half of them will be middle class, right? I think the projections will be is that Indonesia will be in the top 10 economy in the coming 2 or 3 decades, right? That's a conservative projection. But that would never happen if you don't have the population, right? And another thing that we are trying to convert is that we're trying to convert what was old into something new, what was traditional, which was seen as our culture. We used to be skeptical and cynical about our culture, but now we see it with pride and we see it as an asset in how we grow. And this is again consistency, consistent with the cultural confidence that you see in India, in China, in Brazil, in South Africa, across the emerging world. That economic confidence and political confidence is also coupled with cultural confidence. So I think these projections that people say of Indonesia will remain relevant and true if we can keep ourselves on the right upward trajectory. And I think what will matter most, if you ask me, will you keep that upward trajectory, is whether or not we will be able to evolve the right kind of nationalism in Indonesia. I think this is the same thing that is you're experiencing in America, right? I think if Indonesia, in this present generation and the next generations, can evolve the same open, moderate, tolerant, outward-looking, and productive nationalism that we have been able to evolve in recent years, we will keep on that upward trajectory. And it also means that we need to ensure that we have a quality democracy and quality politics. What I'm a bit worried when I see Indonesian politics is that, well, Indonesian democracy is great when you see the formalities. You have great elections, periodic elections. You have good institutions. The institutions are there. But the quality of politics is decreasing in Indonesia for some reason. And this is reflected in the fact that people. Are you here too? You say I didn't notice. I'm sorry. People are people have low self-esteem toward politicians now, in a level that was not there before, right? So again, this worries me if this would produce a democratic deficit, whereby you have at the formal level you have good democracies, elections, and institutional, strength and so on, but the quality of politics deteriorates to the extent that young people who are already cynical at politics now will become even more cynical. Now, that is not healthy for both political and economic development. And what is still happening in Indonesia now, even after 12 years of democratic transition, is still we are experiencing the battle for the soul of Indonesia. This has gone on since independence. People who are more progressive and people who are more conservative. People who are status quo, who want the status quo or want to return even to the old authoritarian days, against people who want to be more open, right? People who are more resistant of change against those who are more embracing of change. People want to impose their views and more restrictive in their philosophy against those who are very open, right? So there's this battle for the soul of Indonesia happens still every day in our politics, in our parliament, within our governments, within the young people, within the civil society, and throughout the country. And the good news, of course, is that those who are progressive, those who are open-minded, those who are reformist and transformational are taking the steer, right? No country can be totally reformist, right? The whole population cannot be totally reformist. There's always going to be pockets of people who will resist the reforms. But at the moment, those who control the direction of the country are those who are considered the reformists. And this leads to my last point about people power. Indonesia was born, you can say, out of people power. In 1945, we achieved our revolution, an epic revolution for independence, driven by a revolution by the people. And it was a very powerful revolution. And then in 1997, the government and the whole regime and political system was toppled again by people power. And I think as democracy is here to stay, as democracy has become a permanent reality for Indonesia, the question is, we still need that people power, but a different type of people power. Not the same uprising that brought the government down in 1998 or delivered us a revolution in 1945, but a people power that is delivered by way of smart policies, smart leadership, smart choices, and smart transformations. There's a new energy and a new confidence now in Indonesia. One of the best polls that I've heard is that 85% of Indonesians, despite of what they say of the parliament, of the government, of politicians, believe that Indonesia is on the right track. And a recent poll also said that Indonesia has the happiest people in the world. I think over 50%, who is, yes, and look at me, look at him, right? So despite our problems, despite our challenges, we count ourselves as the happiest people in the world. And I think those of you who know Indonesia well agree with this. But our ability to maintain this cool, positive, and creative energy, this positive people power is going to be very important in maintaining Indonesia on a steady transformational process. Thank you very much.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you very much for those very insightful remarks. Ambassador Djalal has graciously agreed to take questions. He's very experienced at dealing with the press, so I'm just going to let him select his questioners.
Kathy Murray, when we sat down, I said, I'll have this out because I might tweet you.
Yeah.
And you said you tweet?
Yes.
So what is your Twitter?
My Twitter is Dino Patti Djalal, and I have 80,000 followers. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So you better be nice to me.
Will do.
Thank you. Okay. Wayne.
Dino, I like your comparison with the Arab Spring, so I want to ask you to perhaps go a little further on that. And what I'm thinking about is that actually you didn't really have a revolution when Suharto fell. Mm-hmm. There was people power, he resigned, and his vice president took place. Mm-hmm. And what was it about Habibie, in your opinion, that was, how was he able to make that transition agree with the people power in a way that moved Indonesia forward? Because clearly something changed with the presidency of Suharto's successor. And do you see any analogy in some of the Arab Spring countries where a figure could step in that was part of the old regime in a way, but then was somehow part of the transformation? Or do you, hopefully you agree that Habibie was part of that transformation? But what was it about him, and is there a figure similar to him that may be existing in some of these other countries?
Okay. Thank you very much for the question, but unfortunately time is running out, and so we need to... Look, there's some parallels between Indonesian and Arab Spring. Not parallels, but some things that the Arab Spring countries can learn from. One is the fact that in Indonesia, when we transitioned from one system to the other, we did not break the old oligarch, but we co-opted them into the new system. I'm talking about Golkar. I'm talking about the military, right? So that was important part. I think this is where you had a problem with Iraq, because you took out the old, the old, what do you call it, the old network, and that created some political problems for you. So I think that's relevant. Secondly, in Indonesia, we had, like you said, a president who I think would be known as the most reformist Indonesian president ever, Habibie.
Yeah.
In 18 months, he reformed all the laws. He released all political prisoners. He scrapped all subversive laws. He promised elections. He conducted a referendum in Timor-Leste. All these things that I'm sure no other Indonesian president in his shoes at the time would do, right? And more importantly, he did not seek re-election. He said, I'm going to do all this and I'm gone. How many presidents would say that after only 18 months? And he was a good president, right? So the key to a successful transition is having a guy at the top who is really faster than anyone else and would be able to make and take all these political risks to speed up reforms. And the other thing that I think was important for us, that would be important for the Arab Spring, is get your first elections right. We didn't get our first elections right. In 1999, the party of Megawati got the most votes, PDIP, but she didn't become president. Abdurrahman Wahid became president. And it took us 2-3 years of a lot of constitutional crisis to get that sorted out. And that's a waste of time, right? Now, and this is what's happening in Myanmar at some point as well, because Myanmar's election last year wasn't, was criticized because it did not include NLD and Aung San Suu Kyi, right? And now they've been able to fix that somehow. But getting that first elections right would save you a lot of political and economic energy. And I hope the Egyptians know that, the Tunisians and the others would also know that. Yeah. Yes.
I was wondering how dependent you are today on Singapore for port to handle your products on a transshipment basis and financing with letters of credit such as transferable back-to-backs and things like that. Is it like it was, say, 30 or 40 years ago, or are you doing more of that on a direct basis yourself?
Of doing what?
Well, shipping products.
Oh, yeah. Well, a lot of our products are still going through Singapore for some reason. Singapore is still one of the hubs and trading.
Yeah, I live there. I mean,
Yeah, but it hasn't changed that much. We wish it could change more, but it hasn't changed that much. I agree. That's why we have people like Wayne and Alan Harari. Yes.
Giuseppe Capriati, what do you think of the future of ASEAN, and which role is Indonesia playing within ASEAN?
The future is very bright. I say this because look at where ASEAN was 40 years ago. ASEAN 40 years ago was completely divided between communist Southeast Asia, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. What's the other one? Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and the other non-communist ASEAN, the ASEAN 6, so to speak. They didn't have any dealings with one another. They mistrusted one another, and they were. Cambodia was the site of horrible genocide. 1 million people got killed. There was a Vietnam War. There was proxy wars in Southeast Asia, and so on and so on. And most importantly, a couple decades ago, Southeast Asian countries were not master of their own region. They felt that they were subjects objects rather than subjects. But now the whole Southeast Asia is one under ASEAN. There's a goal of reaching the ASEAN community by 2015. There's no war in ASEAN, both between both proxy wars or wars between ASEAN nations. There's a free trade area within ASEAN, so it's gone a complete transformation, and I think it's one of the most successful regional what do you call it, regionalisms in the world. So I'm quite pleased with how ASEAN has turned out and how ASEAN has adapted to the challenges of the 21st century. Thank you.
My name's Adam. I'm curious, you alluded a little bit to some of the struggles back and forth between those who want reform, those who don't. I was curious how you saw the recent debate over the fuel subsidies and attempt to raise and then failure after the opposition party backed out due to popular opposition. I was curious how you saw that fitting in, that debate, which sort of periodically comes up as oil prices continue to rise, how you saw that fitting into the broader debate over reform, both politically and economically.
Yes. Well, we've done this before. I think one of the first things that President Yudhoyono did in 2005 was to take that bold move of reducing subsidies. I think the price of oil at the time went up by 125%. And people said, if you took this decision, you would fall, because this is what happened in other countries. But he took that decision and he didn't fall. In fact, we're glad he took it, because by the time the global financial crisis hit us in 2008, our macroeconomics had become much more ready for it. And this is why we kept growing. We grew by 4.5% at the height of global financial crisis, which is an amazing thing. Now, at the moment, with oil price again going up over $100, this is, in our view, the government's view, the rational thing to do, because our budget now is about 1,500 trillion rupiah. Don't ask me how many dollars is that. It's a gazillion dollars, right? Now, our budget is 1,500 trillion rupiah, and for infrastructure alone, we spend only 180 trillion. And for subsidies, it's almost 300 trillions, right? And 70% of that subsidy is enjoyed by middle-class people, people who are rich and who can afford to buy petrol, right? So it doesn't make sense economically. This is why the government launched that move to, again, reduce the fuel subsidies. But this is something that we had to go through the parliament. And apparently the political calculations in the parliament was not right. But we will survive. We're quite resilient, yeah. The guy in the middle, yeah.
I would like to ask a question about the G20.
Okay. What's that, by the way? Just kidding.
Indonesia has benefited from that, obviously, providing a global platform for itself and for other emerging economies. Some have said that the G20 has lost some of its focus since the intense activity after the onset of the global financial crisis. What do you see as the prospects for the G20 going forward, and Indonesia's role within the G20?
Well, G20 now has become the premier forum for international economic cooperation. I think it has eclipsed G7 or G8, and we like it that way, because we used to see G7 from the outside, and now we're in the inside. Perhaps the sense of urgency is different than when it was when G20 was created in the aftermath of the global financial crisis, but it's still the forum where you have, I think, 90%, if I'm not mistaken, of the world economy, and you have a forum whereby, even though leaders make decisions that are not binding, it is important to maintain a healthy global economic recovery. For us in Indonesia, we live in a region whereby there's high growth, and you have China, growing 9%, and you have India growing 7%, right? Indonesia is 6.5%, and things are looking good in Asia, but we know it's not sustainable. That we know you cannot have a strong, sustainable, and balanced and inclusive world economy unless Europe heals and unless America also has a dynamic economy. So we have a lot invested in the health of the American economy. And in fact, I'm proud to say that the largest deal ever made by Boeing recently, $22 billion, 200 planes, largest deal ever, was done by an Indonesian airline company. Yeah, so we're doing our part, and we hope that G20 will become ever more important vehicle to achieve that strong, sustainable, and balanced global economy. The agenda has also expanded. There's now a lot of financial inclusion themes, development themes, and so on, and so on. So yeah, good. Alan?
Yes, I just have three comments about your very interesting speech. First one is that I'm a New Yorker, and a lot of us are very happy. You just have to come to the right neighborhoods. And you can come walking with me so that people will think that you're my son. And
Thank you. I'm honored.
I was very interested in the comment you made about the future of the politics in Indonesia. And whereas you have many long-standing commercial families and regional families, I'm wondering what the government might be doing in terms of preparing the next generation of politicians, seeing as what an amazing role model the current parliament has provided for the younger generation of Indonesia. Maybe the Foreign Policy Association should have an office there, or the Fletcher School, something like that. But the idea of, yes, to have a democracy, you need that legislative younger generation coming up.
Sure. I think the challenge, Alan, is this. There's a lot of idealism among the young people. There's a lot of talent among the young people, but they're turned off by politics, right? And because of that, they don't want to join government. And at the elections in 2009, you have a lot of politicians becoming ministers and so on, but it doesn't attract the idealistic, young, energetic talents, right? Because they say, okay, we'll stay in the private sector. We'll see what you can do. There's a lot of corruption still, and so on and so on, right? So I think, I don't know how it can be done, but one of the ways is really to facilitate a method by which these idealistic, young, bright, talented people can go into public service, right? And reform that public service. Because to be honest, the public service is not going to reform itself from the inside, right? It's got to come from the outside. So finding a way to do that. In Indonesia, me and some friends of mine, we formed a group called Modernisator, which is called modernizers in English. And it came about because we saw one friend who was a bright young economist being attacked by conservative economists, and no one stood up for him, right? So we said, hey, let's make a movement. And the idea is not to seize power, but the idea is to spread the values of idealism and progressive thoughts throughout government. And now members of our organizations such as Gita Wirjawan, Mahendra Siregar, Khatib Basri, Emir Shah Sattar, these are people who are running Indonesia now, right? But the point is, the more idealistic people and people with talent get together and look out for one another, and rather than trying to push each other aside, I think the more they do that, the more we will do well. John, by the way, is a member of Modernisator as well, and now he's running Indonesia in the media. Yeah. Okay, I have Naomi and then Pak Don. Yeah.
So my question.
Two last questions.
Yes. Okay.
Is along the lines of social media. Obviously, the nice lady in front of me mentioned you on Twitter, and so therefore you think of Twitter and social media in general as a viable, powerful platform for not just the youth but Indonesians in general, in perhaps not just policy making but around the board to foster education and to foster conversation. So with Indonesia being the fourth largest population on Facebook and third on Twitter and growing exponentially, what do you think is the role that social media has in the future of Indonesia's youth in
Yeah.
particular. I would
Well, we use it at the president's office. There's a way for us to gauge public opinion. One way is to look at the newspapers and the editorials and so on and say, hey, they don't like this. And another way is to look at the Twitters and the Facebooks and have somebody monitor it. And you see a different quality of opinion there, right? So we see it as a very useful gauge of public opinion in Indonesia. But we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg. The social media. There's one instrument that changed human behavior forever. It's called the watch. Before there was a watch, people would eat every time they're hungry. Which is like what I do now, really. Right? But after the watch was invented, people eat more regularly: breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Right? Now, what am I saying? If that one instrument changed human behavior and the human race forever, right? Imagine what these social medias, these tremendous tools of empowerment at the hands of every individual would do to human behavior. I don't have the answer to that, but it's worth having. And one impact that I know is that among young people is turning young people into a more cynical attitude. I don't have the answer why, but if you look at the Twitter tweets and Facebook responses, you see a lot more cynicism among the young people, right? And again, and also we are becoming much more independent on social media. And because my wife is not here, I can say this. I can go here or another place to Hawaii for 2 weeks, and my wife would be staying home, right? And I'll miss her and miss the kids, and but I'll survive, right? But I go to Hawaii and you take away my blackberries for 1 day, you feel something's missing, right? So again, we're only seeing the tip of the iceberg how social media is really changing human behavior. Sorry, Pak Don, you have the last question. Don't tell my wife I said that.
What's her address?
Another question on Indonesia's perception of its place in the international economy. Since the last APEC meeting, the United States, the Obama administration, has been pushing very hard in the region the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with the goal eventually of a region-wide liberal trade agreement. Four, perhaps five of the ASEAN countries have either signed on or have expressed great interest in signing on. But Indonesia has shown coolness to the entire proposition. Could you comment on what the basis of the Indonesian perception and attitude towards the TPP is?
Yeah, thanks. Professor Don, Indonesia does have more cautious attitudes on FTAs. Yeah, some of it have to do with domestic political situation, right? And it's very hard for us, not very hard, but a challenge for us to push through FTAs. This is how we're different than Latin American economies. And what makes TPPs different is that it's not just FTA, it's FTA plus plus. It's a lot more than just a FTA, which makes us even more cautious because the size of our economy, the structure of our economy, and so on. So, but the fact that America has joined TPP changed the game, really, because before TPP was just a mechanism involving several countries. Most of them are small, right? Brunei, Chile, Singapore, and so on. But Vietnam, yes. And then after America joined in, and then others joined in as well, I think the game changed. But I think our position has not moved. We continue to monitor it. What is important for us is make sure that the TPP does not divide ASEAN. As you said, 5 members of ASEAN are in TPP negotiations now. It's important that it doesn't divide ASEAN. And secondly, it's important also that it doesn't take breath and energy away from the world trade, the Doha round, because I know it's stagnating, but keep in mind that 90% of what was supposed to be agreed at Doha has been agreed. And it comes down to a few tariffs that needs to be sorted out, mainly between America and China, right? And I know politically it's impossible for them to move this year, especially in America with the election cycle. But we still have hope that we keep the oxygen on the Doha round, because once the Doha round crumbles, then the alternative for most countries is to go their own ways, and that's not good for the world economy.
Mr. Ambassador, thank you for exhausting all our questions. We'd like to present you with a history of the Foreign Policy Association, appropriately entitled Foreign Policy and a Democracy.
Oh, thank you very much. And I have a gift for you. I have 2 gifts.
Oh my.
One.
We're going to put this in our conference
The
room.
first gift is very important. This is an American gift. It's called, and it's free, and I get it all over New York. It's called a hug. And the second gift is Indonesian contribution to American culture, which is the gong. You have the gong show, right? And this is for you.
This is how we'll call meetings?
To call meetings.
Okay.
So I hope